Okay, so now this is the second video. We're still with watercolors. Instead, now we're gonna have a look at a few basic techniques or the theory behind it. So one is the one that we experimented in class, the first one I believe it was, it's called wet on wet. What does it mean? It means that we're gonna wet the surface of our paper first, and then we add wet paint over it. Let's see what happens. So I grabbed a mop brush like this, quite a big one, and now I'm gonna wet an area, not the whole page, just an area there. Now to make sure that the whole area is wet, you need to have a look on the side of your pad. If the sheen is everywhere where you want it to be, when you want the paper to be wet, that's it, you got it right. Yeah, make sure that there are not puddles, so really push the water down. Don't worry if the paper buckles a little bit, that's fine. Okay, just experimenting here. Now that area is wet. What I'm going to do is grab this other brush and I'm going to choose a color. I think I'm gonna go for something different this time. Let's try this color here. See what it looks like on a wet on wet. Okay, now still quite wet. We're gonna go for it. Let's see what happens. Look at that. You can see there is a lot of water there. Paint. Now, while it's super wet, the paper, the color will go everywhere around that area where it's wet. So like a puddle there of water, so it's a lot of water. And keep it going like that if we want to. The paint usually spreads evenly then by itself, so we shouldn't mess with it too much. That's our wet on wet. And now we let that be, and we're gonna try to do the same thing but wet and dry. So grab the same color. Let's observe what happens. Fine. So as you can see, wet and wet turns much lighter than wet and dry. Now, both are still damp now, so when they get dry, they're gonna get even lighter than they appear here. Now, while we wait for these two areas to get dry, I want to experiment a little bit more, and I want to see what happens if we want to add color on a wet paint. So I'm wetting the area like before for a wet on wet technique. That's it. Grab my brush, grab some color. Oh, the color is coming brighter. You know why? Because this water here, the color that I applied there, it was mostly water because this color hadn't awakened fully. So that's another lesson to learn. Now that let's keep working here. Now that we have this wet surface there, this wet wash, what happens if we go straight now that is super wet and add a further color? Let's see what happens. Let me add some yellow there. The quite wet brush. Let's see what happens if I do this. Look. What's happening here is, I'll make it, I'll get it a bit closer to the camera, is because the yellow was very, very wet, when I added it, it started, especially in this area here, not much there, to be honest, for the moment, but it's pushing the red away. And that's not what we want. We want it to stay there. We want the second color to blend nicely, almost like we're getting it there. Now, this one still has a sheen, and I think we could try and experiment there. But how? I would say that it would be good for us to try and use, let me see, a different brush that doesn't hold too much water, like our flat one. Clean it a little bit. And let's grab that yellow again. Get rid of the excess water. And let's see what happens if I paint this way. There. Look, something is happening there. So to remember that you can move your part. Look what's happening. It's already developing on this side, the cauliflower effect that we try to avoid. At times it's nice to have it, I need to be honest, because it looks looser, more spontaneous and less tight. But that's what happens, it's a choice. That's what happens when the application of the second color on a wet surface, if it's very wet, you will get this. If you wait a little bit longer till the first wash is damp instead of being very wet, and the second color that you apply over it, on top of it, is creamier, less watery, then you should be able to control the paint a little bit more. And it looks like that yellow stripe there is staying on place. Now, let's have a look, and better to keep it flat this way and with that technique. Now, let's try something different. So we have wet on wet, very light color there, because it was the first color that I managed to grab out of the half pan. So mostly water. This is wet on wet, wet on dry, wet on dry. So a bit deeper, still a bit damp now, not too much, but a bit damp. That's the stage when it gets a bit tricky. If you paint over this now, is a bit tricky. And this is a very wet on wet first wash without waiting for it to get done at all. We added a second layer, second coat of paint that was very, very wet. So to avoid that, we need a brush. It doesn't need to be flat, it can be round, it doesn't make any difference. But one of those that doesn't hold much water. Do you remember in our experimentations that we saw that these two don't hold much water, unlike the mop one? So that's things to write in your notes and to keep in mind if you decide to paint in watercolors.